The 9/11 Truth Movement includes academics, engineers, physicists, firefighters, intelligence officials, and some of the very people whose lives have been shattered since September 11th.
Comenzamos. Las famosas Torres Gemelas de Nueva York podrían haber sido destruidas por una explosión y no a causa de los aviones que fueron estrellados contra ellas. Esa es la opinión de muchos expertos estadounidenses que ahora insisten en una nueva investigación de los trágicos hechos.
En 2002, una funcionaria del FBI acusó públicamente a sus jefes de no haber hecho nada para prevenir los atentados del 11 de septiembre. Una declaración que repercutió mucho en la opinión pública de Estados Unidos.
El gobierno intentará intimidar a los activistas para hacerles callar. No sería la primera vez, ya lo han hecho antes.
Richard Gage fundó el movimiento de Arquitectos por la Verdad sobre el 11 de septiembre. Este grupo reúne a más de 1000 profesionales que afirman que no es posible que un avión derrumbe un edificio como las torres del World Trade Center.
Los edificios se destruyeron con explosivos. Varios arquitectos e ingenieros insisten en que el Congreso debe emprender una nueva investigación para dilucidar los hechos.
Algunos expresan sus sentimientos a través de carteles en sus autos o camisetas. Es el caso de Frank Agamemnon.
Nuestro gobierno nos ha mentido sobre el 11 de septiembre. Si la verdad triunfara, probablemente no habría guerras.
A la conferencia La Traición en Estados Unidos han llegado cientos de personas de todo el país. Todos creen que los acontecimientos del 11 de septiembre se deben investigar de nuevo.
Vengo de Virginia para obtener información. Los medios no nos cuentan nada.
El movimiento por la verdad sobre el 11 de septiembre existe desde hace tiempo, pero parece que ahora empieza a preocupar a las autoridades. De hecho, hace poco ha sido incluido junto con Ku Klux Klan en la lista de las asociaciones más odiadas por los ciudadanos en Estados Unidos, según afirman las encuestas. El presidente Kennedy dijo una vez que sin debates y crítica es imposible gobernar un país. Muchos ahora exigen mayor transparencia por parte de los políticos.
På samme tid træder daværende statsminister Poul Nyrup Rasmussen ind i statsministeriet for at holde et sikkerhedsrådsmøde.
Nogenlunde i det øjeblik, jeg træder ind i statsministeriet, får jeg at vide, at det første tårn er nu helt kollapset. Jeg får en melding, jeg tror 5-10 minutter før det fysisk sker, at nu er der overhængende risiko for, at tårnene kollapser. Så jeg vidste, at katastrofen var på vej, og får det så endelig bekræftet i det øjeblik, jeg træder ind, tror jeg, i huset.
The basic question that has been raised by skeptics of the official theory about 9/11 is whether the attacks were permitted or indeed even engineered by the Bush administration in order to carry out an agenda that it already had on the books.
And here is that agenda, the military mission statement of a right-wing think tank, the Project for the New American Century. Written a year before 9/11, it's supported by key members of the current Bush administration.
The drafting was supervised by Cheney, by Donald Rumsfeld, by Paul Wolfowitz, by Jeb Bush, who's the president's younger brother, and by Louis Libby, who's Cheney's chief of staff. This is about control over Middle East oil. It indicates that America is aiming for global leadership, both military and economically, and what it says, I think, is chilling. It says if we are going to transform America into tomorrow's dominant force, that's their phrase, then it's going to be a long process unless there is a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like Pearl Harbor.
That we have to believe that some of these people in the administration would do a very terrible thing. And that is absolutely right.
And it's hard to believe that. I mean, it's such a monstrous thing to do.
But when you look at what people have done for the sake of empire and riches in the past, it is not so hard to believe. People that are good family men have done monstrous things. And we know that from Nazi Germany. They were very cultured, refined gentlemen, many of them, and people could not believe they would be participating in such an event.
All right, let's look in a bit more detail at some of the issues you raise. One of the things you say you believe is that the World Trade Center buildings were brought down not by being struck by the planes, but by explosions, deliberately planted explosions within the buildings. What's the evidence for that?
There are at least 10 characteristics of the way these buildings came down that can be easily explained by the use of explosives, and not a single one of them can be explained without the use of explosives. So this image of the planes hitting the towers, and then the image of the towers coming down, and then the thousands of people who were killed, this was ingrained into the American psyche. And it got the American people ready for revenge, and frankly, many of them didn't care against whom. They wanted revenge, and frankly, against Arab Muslims.
Did you worry at all about the sort of criticism you get in publishing these books and these series, that you'd be accused of being a nutcase?
Oh, the conspiracy theory charge?
Yeah.
Well, the official theory about 9/11 is a conspiracy theory, that 19 members of Al-Qaeda conspired to defeat the most powerful military force in history and to bring down 3 buildings by hitting 2 of them. So it's a conspiracy theory. So anybody who says, well, what you're talking about is conspiracy theory, and we know that conspiracy theories are nutty, they ignore the fact the official theory is a conspiracy theory. So the question is, which of the conspiracy theories is true? And we judge that by which one has the best evidence. And when you look at the evidence for the official theory, it all evaporates.
David Griffin, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, a lot of issues to consider in that particular interview, and listening to it with me are, of course, Peter Hitchens and John Irvin, Dean of Coventry. And we're also joined in our London studio by former employee of the British Security Services, David Shaler. Good morning, David. I'd like to go to you first of all. You're obviously listening to that particular interview. It has been put forward as a nutcase theory. But what's your opinion on it?
Well, I think it's not case theory at all. I think if you look at the evidence, Dr. Griffin is absolutely right. There are issues that were not explained by the 9/11 Commission. There was evidence that was not looked at by the 9/11 Commission. But particularly what they've got to answer is how there are hotspots on ground zero taken by a thermal satellite 5 days later. There's no explanation in the official theory about where the energy comes from to create that. But if you take the theory of controlled demolition with the use of the explosive thermite, one of the byproducts of that is molten iron. So clearly this would be the heat from the molten iron still glowing. And that's a very good example, really, of where the official story can't answer the question, but we can with our theory.
But on the other hand, I just made a few notes myself while the film was on. I mean, if you look at the monstrous actions that we've witnessed, and it still spells out as much horror today when you watch the film as it did 5 years ago. But, you know, he talks in this area about those, ingrained images of the towers coming down, conditioning for revenge. I mean, surely that's a very far-fetched theory, that there would be so...
No, I mean, we've actually realised now through historical research that this kind of what we call false flag terrorism is in fact routine. This is not 9/11 is not a new precedent. It's part of foreign policy and so on. And of course that's exactly what it was designed to do. And in fact the project for the New American Century, a year before 9/11, produced a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And in that they say they need to control the oil supply and the gas supply across the Middle East, and they say to do that we've got to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. And they say that the American public won't stand for that unless there is a catastrophic and cataclysmic event like a new Pearl Harbor. And we contend that that is the new Pearl Harbor. These neocons are people who've made money from the reconstruction contracts in Iraq and so on. This was quite deliberately designed to inflame American public opinion, to justify adventurism on the part of the Americans in the Middle East.
David Ray Griffin, noto teologo e scrittore americano, è l'autore del libro Commissione 11 settembre, distorsioni e omissioni, che ha letteralmente smontato la tesi ufficiale del governo americano. In questa conferenza all'Università del Wisconsin, Griffin elenca i motivi principali per cui ritiene che le torri non possano essere crollate da sole, ma siano invece state demolite con l'uso di esplosivi.
For example, the buildings collapsed straight down and at virtually free fall speed, as in controlled demolitions. And then the rubble smoldered for months afterwards. With regard to the Twin Towers in particular, many people in the building said that they felt or heard explosions. Virtually all the concrete of these enormous structures was pulverized into very fine dust. Try this. Get a piece of concrete and drop it a little over 1,000 feet and see if it pulverizes into very fine dust. It won't happen. Much of this dust, along with steel and aluminum, was blown out horizontally from the buildings several hundred feet. And pools of molten steel were found beneath the rubble. These and even more effects point to the existence of very powerful, precisely placed explosives. In any case, when we look at all these features of the collapses, the idea that they could have been caused by the impact of the airplanes plus the resulting fires is ridiculous. This is even clearer with regard to building number 7, which wasn't hit by any airplane, and yet it came down about 5:30 that afternoon. Its collapse remains so impossible to explain, except as controlled demolition, that the 9/11 Commission report did not even mention it, as if the collapse of a 47-story building was not worthy of comment.
Most of us can probably remember where we were during the events of 9/11, but how sure are you about the events that led up to the incident? Some are questioning the government's account, and one of them is our guest. Dr. Bob Bowman joins us. He's a retired Air Force colonel. Thanks for stopping by.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
A little bit about your background first before we talk about some of the things that you have to say. Who are you?
Well, as you said, Lieutenant Colonel USAF, retired, flew 101 combat missions in Vietnam, directed all the Department of Defense Star Wars programs under Presidents Ford and Carter. My PhD is in aeronautics and nuclear engineering from Caltech. I've chaired 8 major international conferences. That's probably enough.
Yeah. No, but you also were looking at a congressional seat?
Oh, yes. I ran for Congress in 2006. Came pretty close. But I was beaten in the end by my 7-term incumbent Republican opponent and his Diebold touchscreen voting machines.
Well, needless to say, you have some background in the federal government.
Absolutely.
And you are questioning a little bit about some of the accounts of what led up to 9/11?
Well, sure. We haven't been told the truth. I've talked to both Governor Kane and Congressman Hamilton, the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission report, and they admit that there are outright falsehoods in their official 9/11 final report, a report tightly controlled by the White House, written by Philip Zelikow, a White House flack. So it doesn't tell the story. It doesn't even address most of the questions. Doesn't tell why Building 7 came down, which wasn't even hit by an aircraft, in what appears to be a perfect controlled demolition. Not only doesn't answer the questions, it doesn't even ask many of the pertinent questions. Beyond that, beyond the cover-up of the report, when you combine that with confiscation of audio tapes, videotapes, black boxes, and other evidence by the FBI, it's clear that regardless of who was responsible for 9/11, the subsequent cover-up was itself a conspiracy involving elements of the White House and the intelligence establishment.
Well, Doctor, some would say what you don't know won't hurt you. Now, the general public out there may not want to know a lot of the things you're talking about because they understand there were some terrorists, they understand there were some buildings, things went down, and there was a great deal of loss of people and a tragedy in the United States. They may not want to know a lot about the things.
Well, we have to do that because
The Bush administration exploited that tragedy to deceive us into illegal, unnecessary wars of aggression in Afghanistan and Iraq. Whether or not anyone in the government was involved in killing almost 3,000 people on 9/11, the Bush administration is directly responsible for the loss of over 3,500 young American soldiers in Iraq, more in Afghanistan, to say nothing of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. Now, this is an impeachable offense and an act of treason. I said so before the war started. It still is. We know that this war, and I said this before it started, has absolutely nothing to do with national security or freedom or democracy or human rights or weapons of mass destruction or protecting our allies or disarming Iraq. It has to do with money, it has to do with oil, and it has to do with raw imperial power, and it is wrong. And Congress should immediately impeach Dick Cheney and George W. Bush for deceiving us into this war, costing so many thousands of lives. And then we can end the occupation of Iraq and prevent another attack, perhaps a nuclear attack on Iran, which the Bush administration admits they want to do. But we mustn't let them get away with it.
You have a petition, or there's a petition circulating, is there not, for this investigation you're talking about?
A lot of people are clamoring for a new investigation of 9/11, I'm asking for an investigation of the cover-up. And more importantly, I'm asking for impeachment based on the exploitation of 9/11. Whether or not anybody in the United States had anything to do with it or not, they have exploited it for their own financial reasons, having nothing to do with national security. They have sacrificed the lives of over 3,500 of our young men and women in Iraq. And if that isn't a treasonable, impeachable offense, I don't know what is.
Yeah, you're talking about, obviously, integrity here, or something much deeper, because the president's going to be termed out. He's going to be gone anyway. So impeaching him...
Yeah, but he's got over a year to do more damage, including a possible nuclear attack on Iran, which I believe would destroy the United States as we know it. We have already lost so many of our friends, so much of our credibility around the world, so many of our allies. If we did that, Russia and China would turn against us for sure. We'd be isolated in the world completely, and rightly so, as the #1 rogue nation on earth.
Well, you've just touched, I think...
We've got to save our country.
I know, it's just as though you've touched on the tip of what it is that you like to say. Website, how can people find out more?
www. if you want, thepatriots.us.
All they needed was a trigger to put it in place, and that is what 9/11 provided them with.
They only think in terms of power. Democracy and constitutional states don't play a role.
The truth is, conspiracies do sometimes occur.
I can only say, the official story is so inadequate and far-fetched that there must be a different one. Michael Meacher and Andreas von Bülow, two former ministers. The Germans served under Helmut Schmidt 25 years ago. More recently, the Brit was a minister in Blair's war government. These two experienced politicians have grave doubts about what the Americans call the war on terrorism. More importantly, they think there's a lot more behind September 11th than we're allowed to know.
You have to consider what happened before 9/11, at 9/11, and afterwards. And I think a much better explanation than the war on terror, which I think is bogus.
Eric Hofschmidt, author of the book Painful Questions, is a metal-cutting software engineer.
The floors of the World Trade Center towers were three-dimensional mesh of steel beams. You have to keep in mind now the floor is about an acre in size. There are thousands of joints all over it. In order for the floor to fall down, thousands of joints would have to break simultaneously. And then if you look at the speed at which this came down, less than 10 seconds, you blink your eye and thousands of joints just popped somehow. The only way you can explain that is with explosives. They had to have had explosives placed all over the floors at the primary joints. And then that would explain how all of the joints broke at such a rapid rate. The debris was crashing from one floor to the next. Debris cannot crash through steel and concrete floors as fast as it falls through the air. And there was no slowing. Explosives had to be breaking the joints ahead of the falling rubble, which is why the top half starts off collapsing slowly and then it starts picking up speed.
This is a pancake collapse. Why don't we see piles of floors at ground zero? And paper blown everywhere. Wouldn't a pancake collapse have trapped the contents inside? What blew this paper all over New York?
And I had to see it again, because as most people, I didn't know about Building 7. And it is going down completely symmetrically in 6.5 seconds. It's going down with this zip. And as a scientist, you're trained to watch your environment in an analytical fashion. You always think, now how does this happen, how does this happen? And this I just couldn't understand and cope with. Why should this building come down, which I've never heard about before in itself? I think this should raise some eyebrows, actually. Why haven't I heard about Building 7 before? And then it's coming down like this with no apparent reason. So I had to push the button again and again. And it took me weeks, actually, to digest this. And I think this is common to most persons, to realize what you have seen. But once you have realized this, there is no way back. So you can either speak out or you can live in shame. And from that on I got more and more interested. And I found out that the evidence for controlled demolition is overwhelming. The evidence for thermite is also, first, I told you that the thermite reaction produced molten iron. Now molten iron was pouring out of one of the towers. Molten iron was in pools of molten iron in the rubble after 9/11 for weeks and months. The surface temperature was 735 degrees after 3 days of heavy showers. It took them 3 months to put out the fire. It was declared officially extinguished on December the 20th. Now this is kind of fire. and the point is that the thermite kept on reacting. This was the bitch's brew of thermite chemistry for 3 months. Very sophisticated, very complicated. It's a masterpiece in demolition.
And who would be capable of producing such a masterpiece of demolition?
It is not compatible with the official conspiracy theory, the one with Osama bin Laden and the 19 hijackers. So I'm an anti-conspiracy theorist. I'm against the official conspiracy theory. But it's up for a criminal, we must have a criminal investigation to find out. This was a crime, and it has never been investigated as a crime.
You're the first team to have examined the rubble and the first team to have picked this up. Why do you think that is?
Technically, the collapses were investigated by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So they should have looked into the dust. And they have been encouraged many times to look for remains of explosives, to look for remains of thermite. And actually there is some, when there is a fire in the United States which is suspicious or which is violent or which is unexpected, according to some regulation, you should look for thermite. It is because it is you can use it for arson, and if you want to burn your house, this is the way to do it. You put in a thermic reaction and you go on vacation and you can trigger it with your cell phone and long distance if you wish. So this is routine for FBI to look for remains of thermite. This they do very frequently actually, but they didn't do it this time.
I mean, obviously you're a real scientist, if you like, so it's understandable that you don't want to be associated with conspiracy theorists and don't like that kind of term. What would you say to people who do lump you in that same category?
Then I must repeat, I mean, who are being fooled here, because the official conspiracy theory, yeah, people call me strange things, and conspiracy theorists is not meant kindly, but who are being fooled here when we are being presented with an official conspiracy theory without any proofs, without a criminal investigation, with nobody being charged with this, and nobody is wanted. Osama bin Laden is not wanted by FBI for this. I mean, shouldn't there be some few questions to ask here? So I will turn the question back and say, who are the fools?
Casi todas las imágenes del World Trade Center después del ataque que ustedes vieron lo grabé yo.
Él es Kurt Sonnenfeld, uno de los dos únicos camarógrafos que estuvieron dentro del Ground Zero apenas iniciado el ataque. Empleado del gobierno de Estados Unidos, trabajaba para el FEMA, organismo oficial dedicado a las grandes catástrofes, como por caso la del huracán Katrina. El FEMA, dice Sonnenfeld, fue convocado ante la emergencia cuando nadie sabía de las características de lo ocurrido todavía en las Twin Towers.
En este momento estaba prematura para llamar FEMA, porque en este momento los medios era diciendo que un avión pequeño se encostó contra la Torre Norte. No es suficiente para llamar FEMA en este momento. Por ejemplo, en huracán Katrina demoró 10 días para llamar FEMA.
¿Y en las torres cuánto tiempo tardó el llamado?
Como 5 minutos.
El camarógrafo plantea interrogantes que disparan sospechas.
¿Sabías que en el fin de semana antes del ataque del World Trade Center, todo el suministro eléctrico del World Trade Center era cortado por 36 horas en una operación muy inusual? Y en las semanas antes de los ataques, los edificios eran evacuados en una manera muy inusual.
Sonnenfeld estuvo allí y no entiende cómo el llamado edificio 7, que albergaba las oficinas de espionaje de la CIA más importantes fuera de Washington, se vino abajo sin ser lesionado por avión alguno ni parte de avión alguna.
Edificio 7 casi no fue mencionada por los medios y ni por la investigación oficial que este edificio hizo implosión perfecta. Unas 9 horas después se cayó los Torres Gemelas. Demoró 6.5 segundos en caer libremente. Y eso es casi el mismo tiempo que necesita para un ladrillo para caer libremente desde el techo de este mismo edificio. Y en historia moderna nunca cayó un edificio de acero y con protección anti-incendio cayó en esta manera.
Debajo del edificio 6, que sí colapsó, funcionaba otra dependencia de la CIA con documentación secreta ubicada en una bóveda subterránea. Sonnenfeld estuvo allí y lo que vio le resultó particularmente raro.
Vimos al dentro de esta bóveda que el muro estaba roto y la puerta estaba semi abierta y vimos al dentro y no había nada, era vaciado completamente y ¿cómo es posible para vaciar este bóveda después la primer avión chocó contra la Torre Norte?
Si alguien vació esa bóveda antes del ataque, si ciertos edificios cayeron sin razón aparente alguna, si el principal organismo para las catástrofes llegó al lugar cuando el incidente parecía menor, si antes del 11S hubo evacuaciones sorpresivas y cortes de luz misteriosos, el gobierno de Estados Unidos sabía de los atentados de antemano. Tal es la afirmación que Sonnenfeld concluye en un libro de su autoría titulado El perseguido. Es que el camarógrafo tiene asilo político en el país, es protegido día y noche por 2 agentes argentinos, fue acusado de asesinato tras el suicidio de su esposa, fue absuelto por este cargo en el 2002, pero invocando tal sospecha, Interpol llegó a su casa de Barracas en el 2004 con orden de llevarse todas sus pertenencias y documentos. Lo acusaban, como la frase célebre de las películas, por un crimen que no cometió. Estuvo preso aquí, como antes en Estados Unidos, y no terminaron ahí sus tormentos.
Yo fui falsamente acusado, torturado, encarcelado, perseguido en 2 continentes por mi país, porque tenían miedo de lo que yo vi y que yo sabe en mi trabajo antes del World Trade Center y después los ataques del World Trade Center también.
Sonnenfeld, como empleado de la Casa Blanca antes del 11 de septiembre, registraba también actividades confidenciales de su gobierno en instalaciones dedicadas al desarrollo de armas químicas y nucleares. Por lo que vio allí, por lo que vio en el Ground Zero y sobre todo por las conclusiones que arriesga en su libro, es que hombres anónimos todavía hoy lo espían en una ignota plaza en este alejado rincón del continente. ¿Por qué lo vigilan? ¿Acaso porque en torno al evento histórico que cambió la historia moderna, la verdad, la completa verdad, también esté todavía cubierta de escombros?
Sus tomas fueron las únicas que se vieron en todo el mundo. Era el único camarógrafo con acceso total a la zona del desastre.
Total access. There wasn't total access. Yes. One of the first things that the government did was to close the perimeter of Ground Zero and prohibit all media from entering. Every 5 meters around the perimeter, you would see a sign hanging that said all cameras and video cameras are prohibited. Violators will be prosecuted and their equipment will be confiscated. In other words, they were very paranoid about other cameras being present. In other words, they refused to allow the media to come in. They refused to allow any cameras in except for the official government cameras. At Ground Zero, there were millions and millions of papers floating around everywhere. It was really kind of surrealistic how much paper survived. The concrete was a business center. The real business center, financial center and government center, both. Government center too? Yeah, both of which love their documents, you know. But no, it's I don't know if it's well known, but the World Trade Center had many offices of government agencies. Had at the building number 6, for example, was U.S. Customs, which is a more militarized. It's not like the aduana here. It's militarized, and they can make arrests. They can store evidence. They can weapons and drugs. It's a police force that controls who and what comes in and out of the country. And, for example, if they catch drugs or weapons or even nuclear material. I remember you see something strange in Customs office. Yes, I did. But that Building 6 was almost completely, if not completely, government offices. In Building 7 also was offices for the Department of Defense, FBI, Secret Service. It was also then discovered, too, that was the largest clandestine office of the CIA outside of Virginia was in Building 7. That office was used to spy on the United Nations as well as all of the international
the CIA was spying on the United Nations.
On the United Nations and on the World Trade Center as well. They were spying on the international financial agencies there.
I met Rockefeller through a female attorney I knew who called me up one day and said, one of the Rockefellers would like to meet you. I had made a video called Mad as Hell, and he'd seen the video and wanted to meet me and knew I was running for governor of Nevada. So sure, I'd love to meet him. And I met him and I liked him, and he was a very, very smart man. And we used to talk and share ideas and thoughts. And he's the one who told me 11 months before 9/11 ever happened that there was going to be an event. Never told me what the event was going to be, but there was going to be an event. And out of that event, we were going to invade Afghanistan to run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. We were going to invade Iraq, you know, to take over the oil fields, establish a base in the Middle East, and make it all part of the New World Order. And we'd go after Chavez in Venezuela. And sure enough, later 9/11 happened. And I remember he was telling me how how you're going to see soldiers looking in caves for people in Afghanistan and Pakistan and all these places. And there's going to be this war on terror, which is no real enemy, and the whole thing is a giant hoax, you know, but it's a way for the government to take over the American people.
He told you it was going to be a hoax.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, there's no question. He says there's going to be war on terror, and he's laughing. There's no who are we fighting? I mean, why do you think 9/11 happened, and then nothing's happened since then? Do you think that our security is so great here that these people who pulled off 9/11, who were able to, can't knock down another plane? Come on, it's ridiculous. 9/11 was done by people in our own government and our own banking system to perpetuate the fear of the American people into subordinating themselves to anything the government wants them to do. That's what it's about, and to create this war, this endless war on terror. And that's why and that was the first lie. And the next lie was going into Iraq, you know, to get Saddam Hussein out with his weapons of mass destruction. That was the next lie.
I support a new investigation wholeheartedly. It's a given. And when you stop and think what's happened in the last 9 years, where a voluntary investigation has taken place by people like architects and engineers and other scientific groups, and have put forth a plethora of knowledge that questions what the government said about the event. And so we need an investigation to look at this, take up all of the information that these voluntary groups have put forward, and pursue that scientific knowledge that's there to its conclusion. And that conclusion is that something happened, and it wasn't, and it's not what the government led us to believe happened. This is very serious. We're talking about an event in American history that there's no comparison by and large. Here it's initiated 3 wars. 1 war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and a war on terror, which is obviously not a war, but it's a device to sustain the American efforts to fund the military-industrial complex. That's what's at stake. And of course, the view is that, well, who's going to initiate this investigation? Well, there's only 2 possibilities. One is the Congress, the other is the people. Now, the Congress has not seen fit to pursue this, and there's very obvious reasons why. members of Congress or political leaders have a stake in their own perpetuity, getting reelected, staying in power, and so they do not want to associate themselves with issues that are not a win-win. And since the government and the media has marginalized these efforts to re-examine what happened on 9/11, and they've marginalized it to such a degree, calling this conspiracy theories. We're not talking about any conspiracy theory here. We're talking about scientific evidence that has been put forth for any reasonable person to look at and question and say, hey, there's something wrong here. And so...
La primera pregunta, yo no sé de eso nada, aunque tengo mis sospechas. Tengo las sospechas de que detrás del 11S hay algo más que los hombres de Al Qaeda y esos aviones. Indicios, he leído algo, no gran cosa. No se habla para nada de lo que pasó en el Pentágono, con un avión, ¿qué pasó? Eso se ha olvidado. Recuerden ustedes lo que ocurrió entonces. En la historia de Estados Unidos está llena de atentados que ellos se hacen a sí mismos para justificar la invasión. Que yo recuerde ahora mismo, se lo hicieron al Reino de España para que España tontamente entrase en la guerra contra ellos, donde los barcos españoles, el almirante que los mandaba, dice, no puedo entrar en combate, mis cañones no les llegan. Pero el gobierno de entonces montó desfiles militares a los cuales a veces una parte de nuestro pueblo están aficionados y mandó a nuestros soldados a la muerte. En el Golfo de Tonkin, Estados Unidos montó otra cosa para justificar su entrada en la guerra de Vietnam. Y así un largo etcétera. Claro, a mí me acusan de antiamericanismo, no. Yo soy anticapital estadounidense porque es un país que creció a expensas de matar indios, de quitarles sus terrenos y escogida sus ideas de toda la filosofía que informó Gran Bretaña. La conquista, los piratas, etcétera. Por tanto, datos no tengo, pero sí creo, por lo que he podido referencia, que efectivamente aquí hay también un montaje. He leído que determinados materiales de lo que estaban hechos las Torres Gemelas no pueden derruirse con determinada temperatura, que es una temperatura que no la produce un avión que choca, sino que tiene que ser producto de algo que ha sido allí. He leído que se le avisa a determinados trabajadores de determinadas características que no acudan a trabajar ese día a los centros, efectivamente. Pero realmente el poder ha utilizado a lo largo de la historia la ingenuidad de la gente y a veces los malos pensamientos de la gente. En España se ha utilizado al judío, al moro o al mendigo, se lo ha utilizado como culpable de muchos males que están pasando. Y el pueblo cae una y otra vez a cuatro patas.
This could be, here we are just a few minutes before the film is to be shown, this could turn out to be a landmark event. This could be something that really changes the face of the 9/11 movement.
The 9/11 is the paradigm of the fabric of lies and of deception. The mass media is lying. That means those who should control the politician are lying, are the first who are lying. I propose simply to change the situation, to begin to attack them on their territory, going on TV where they are the master and attacking. Well, we have to organize a movement. The battle, the modern battle is here. The media, mainstream media has changed politics and our life and our way of thinking and our way of love and our way of hating and so on. This is a new situation where we are. That means we will work for the truth on 9/11 and for our liberty.
for our mass liberty.
Grazie di essere qui.
Former president of German Bundesbank said there were some put options to buy up some stocks of United Airlines and American Airlines. And for politicians to say something is one thing, but for the president of Central Bank of Germany to say something is more serious and more credible. After my time here and my participation into the NGO meeting in Amsterdam later this week, I'm going back to report to wider group of politicians in Japan. And I'm most grateful for the courage that Congressman Reza has taken in this venue of the European Parliament. If we work together, I think we can be a majority to be backed by many citizens of the world. So it's a great opportunity for the citizens through the internet, which has been the invasion of the military people, and they have the upper hands of the technologies. But now we have the upper hands of the conscience of the people to find real truth. Thank you.
Now, the best known contradiction probably is the Mineta-Cheney story that Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta reported to the 9/11 Commission that when he went under the White House to the underground bunker, he got there at 9:20 and Vice President Cheney was already there. And then he told this story about the young man coming in and his plane coming in, and this was before the Pentagon was struck. Well, when the 9/11 Commission wrote its account, they said Cheney got there at almost 10 o'clock, perhaps 9:58. So you had a divergence there of about 45 minutes. That's pretty serious contradiction. Richard Myers, General Myers, who was the acting chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so he was the the senior military official in the Pentagon that day. So presumably a lot of people knew where he was, and yet there is a contradiction that Myers himself and the 9/11 Commission say that he was up on Capitol Hill several miles away talking to Senator Cleland. But Richard Clark, when he wrote his book, Against All Enemies, reported that he headed up a video conference from the White House and that Richard Myers was in the Pentagon participating in that video conference. So here we have a pretty serious contradiction. Ted Olson reported to CNN that his wife had called him on a cell phone from Flight 77. And this was the proof that Flight 77 was still in the air and therefore helped support the view that Flight 77 was what hit the Pentagon. Ted Olson first said she called on a cell phone, then he said it was a seatback phone, and he went back and forth. Finally ended up with saying it was a seatback phone. Well, a 9/11 researcher from Germany contacted American Airlines and said, I see in your material that your Boeing 757s don't have airphones, don't have seatback phones. So how did the people from Flight 77 call? And the customer service representative said, that's right. We do not have seatback phones on our 757s. They had to use their cell phones. In 2006, the FBI turned in a report at the Moussaoui trial on all the phone calls from all 4 flights. And when they got to Flight 77 and they got to Barbara Olson, they said, 1 attempted call, unconnected, 0 seconds. Now this is pretty astounding. The FBI is part of the Department of Justice. And yet the FBI said that the former Solicitor General of the Department of Justice, Ted Olson, that his story about Barbara Olson is not true. She did not call him twice. She didn't call him once. Now this should be screaming headlines. FBI says former Solicitor General was either lied or he was duped. Those are the only alternatives you have.
How do you feel tonight went?
Oh, once we got going, it was quite good. The film was very good, and the discussion. Obviously, the audience was very passionate. Stayed till 11 o'clock, and would have stayed longer if the translators could have stayed longer. So I thought it was a great success.
You know him from movies like Platoon and Wall Street, and in addition to seeing him every week on 2.5 Men, opening tonight, you can see him in Scary Movie 4. Please welcome the indestructible Charlie Sheen. Happy almost Easter.
Hey, back at you. Thank you.
You had some interesting comments. You were on a radio show and you talked about 9/11, and you have is it a theory, or you just don't believe the government account of what happened on 9/11?
I just had questions.
Yeah?
I had a lot of questions, and the forum I chose to voice those questions in is the Alex Jones radio show, and just because he's a guy that I've been a fan of and followed for a lot of years, and you know, I got attacked. I mean, there were a lot of hit pieces. The reaction was
people get very mad when celebrities have opinions.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand. I know he's not qualified. He doesn't. You know, he's just who the hell is he to have an opinion about something so horrible? And you know, it was sad because they didn't really take a look at any of the stuff I was asking them to look at, any of the evidence or any of the stuff that generated those questions. You know, and they said, "Oh, he's another tinfoil hat wearing Hollywood clown." You know, and it's like the only. You know, I felt that the only real validation I needed was just being a tax-paying American that loves my country.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just something that you wonder about, and you would like to know more about, sure. I assume. And do you study the tapes? I've
done a lot of research, and it's not just me, it's the people that have come before me, the experts and the engineers and the physicists and the scientists and the scholars that raised a lot of these things, and I took a look at their research and said, yeah, it doesn't add up. A lot of it doesn't add up, hence these questions, you know. And there's two areas. There's Building 7 and there's the 5 frames from the Pentagon. Don't listen to me. Do your own research, you know. But I think that, you know, what happened to a time in this country when we were entitled, when we had a constitutional and a God-given right to be curious about things that didn't make sense. That's all it was.
Because we have a lot of cable shows now. And
yeah, I was an MI5 intelligence officer. An agent is someone that you recruit and send to infiltrate groups. If you're an officer, you coordinate the operations within MI5. And I worked there in the 1990s, which is where I met a man called David Shaler, who was my ex-partner as well as my ex-colleague. And we worked there for about 6 years each. And during that time, we saw so many things going wrong, so many crimes being committed, that we decided to resign and blow the whistle on the spies. Because we did that, we ended up literally on the run around Europe, ahead of their secret police. We had to live in hiding for 10 months in France, and then they tried to extradite David from France to stand trial in the UK. So he was put in prison in Paris in 1998 for 4 months. That extradition attempt failed, so then we had another 2 years living in exile in Paris, and then he voluntarily returned in the year 2000 and stood trial for a breach of a law called the Official Secrets Act, which makes it a crime for anyone who has worked as an intelligence officer to say anything ever about their work in MI5. Even if you're reporting murder on the part of the spies, you're the one that's committing the crime by reporting it.
Okay, so what can you tell us about the 9/11 attack, the London attacks and false flag operations in general?
The primary reason why I left and blew the whistle was because of a false flag terrorist operation, which occurred in 1996 when MI6, which is the sort of overseas wing of the intelligence agencies in the UK, funded a plot to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. Now, obviously that went wrong because Gaddafi is still very alive, but it did kill innocent people, both with the explosion under the car and the ensuing security shootout. And also it was illegal under UK law, because one of the few things that is real about James Bond is that they do have a license to kill if they get prior written permission from their political masters. Now, in this case, they didn't get permission from the Foreign Secretary. So it was illegal as well as a highly unethical and immoral attack. So we personally witnessed a false flag attack. When it came to look at things like 9/11 and 7/7, you've got to bear in mind that there is this sort of standard weapon that intelligence agencies use, which is false flag terrorism, to gain their political ends. So that's what hooked me in my interest on 9/11, because there are so many unanswered questions about that attack that at the very least I would say we need a new inquiry just to deal with that mountain of evidence. But also if you look at 7/7 as well, there are some strange anomalies. I don't think there's anywhere near as much evidence about whether it is or isn't an inside job as there is for 9/11. But a couple of the notable anomalies were that the train that the bombers, the alleged bombers, were supposed to have taken that day from Luton down to London was cancelled. And yet the government said in its official narrative, yes, they took the 7:40 train that morning to get to King's Cross and then to spread out from King's Cross onto the tubes and carry out their bombings. And they can't physically have done it because the train didn't run. In fact, there is no train that morning, they're all delayed, there is no train that morning that would have placed them at the right time in King's Cross station to have carried out the attacks at the times when they occurred. So there's that issue. There's also a very strange coincidence as well. There was a man called Peter Power who runs a company called Visor Consultants, which specialises in running terrorism drills so that people can learn how to respond. He's a former senior counter-terrorism officer from the Metropolitan Police as well. And he was running an exercise that morning. And after the bombings had occurred, or the explosions had occurred, he went on the national media to talk about it. And he said live that he was running this operation, and halfway through the operation, the attacks occurred. And they occurred in precisely the same stations at precisely the same times as the ones in his drill. And he said in those interviews that the hair stood up on the back of his neck because of the coincidence. Now, I don't know. It certainly would be intriguing to find who he was running those drills for, who was paying him, who had organised it. But also, it's part of a pattern for other incidents, like the Madrid bombings, like 9/11 itself. Before these big, high-profile terrorist atrocities, there seems to be some sort of security drill going on, which can confuse the initial response to a live attack. Whether that was the case in London, we don't know. But again, we haven't had any form of independent inquiry. We've just had a faceless bureaucrat write an anonymous official narrative, which has now been shown to be full of factual errors. So again, we need a new proper inquiry into 7/7.
For the 9/11 attacks, a lot of people say there must be thousands of people involved.
If you want to run any sort of terrorist or false flag attack, it's very much need to know, because it's usually highly illegal. So there might be one or two people who have the overall picture, and then other people will have compartmentalised views of what is happening. And there's very much a need to know. I mean, other projects have been kept very well hidden for years. In the Manhattan Project to develop nuclear weapons, I think 130,000 people were involved in that, and nobody breathed a word for years. Same with the Iran-Contra scandal in the 80s, about 5,000 people involved, and it took years for that to be uncovered. So even if it were the case that thousands of people were involved in something illegal on 9/11, coming out of the American administration, the American government, they would probably keep quiet. And also, where would their interests lie in going public about it? One, it would certainly ruin their livelihoods, and it might well jeopardise other things up to and including their lives. So there's a strong incentive to keep quiet if you're involved in those sort of things. What I think we need, as well as an independent inquiry, is some sort of truth commission whereby people can give evidence for immunity. So they will say, yes, actually this happened, I was involved in planning this particular little aspect, but because they've come clean, they've spoken the truth, they are no longer facing some sort of legal penalty. I mean, that happened very well, for example, in South Africa after the apartheid system collapsed, where they had a Truth Commission, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that could be a way of encouraging people to blow the whistle.
Are you afraid of blowing the whistle?
I was petrified of blowing the whistle, yes. because I knew that when Shayla and I went public about the crimes of MI5 and MI6, they would pursue us relentlessly, and they have indeed. You know, 3 years in exile, on the run, 2 highly fraught trials. And also you get blacklisted, so you can't make a living, and Shayla, unfortunately, seems to have had some sort of breakdown because of all the pressure he's been under as well. So you do pay a high price for it, and I'm not surprised so few people do it.
Okay. What are intelligence services for?
What are intelligence services for? That's a very good question. I wrote a book called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers, which the government banned for years. And in it I say, look, it's not working. We need a rethink. What are our countries realistically facing as threats to their national security, and how can they best protect themselves from that? Take a step back, think about it intellectually, and then put an agency in place to deal with those real threats, not some phantasm out there in the Middle East.
What are your wishes for the future?
Personally or politically? Both. Well, certainly I do a lot of work for the 9/11 Truth Movement in terms of organising speaking tours for people like Ray Griffin, Richard Gage, William Rodriguez, and I do my own tours as well. I'm off to Canada in 2 weeks to do a national speaking tour. And I would like there to be I would like the movement to break through. I would like people to realise, actually, we need new inquiry. It looks like we've been lied to, because the way 9/11 has been misused to act as the foundation for the war on terror, to justify the wars in the Middle East, to justify the shredding of our constitutions, is disgraceful. And there is such a mountain of evidence to disprove the official account. I think if we can get that evidence in front of people, it would be very easy to bring down the whole house of cards. You know, disprove 9/11, we disprove the war on terror, the need for wars, the need for the shredding of our freedoms. So that's my political wish, is to spread the word as rapidly as possible. And it's great, that we can use the internet to do that as well.
I take the threat of terrorism seriously, and I think we all do. And I think it's really disingenuous for the government to invoke and sort of scandalize our memories, to sort of exploit the national trauma that we all suffered together and worked so hard to come through, to justify programs that have never been shown to keep us safe, but cost us liberties and freedoms that we don't need to give up, and our Constitution says we should not give up.
But you can see how it happened. Guys with box cutters spent $200 using our own aviation system to take down our own buildings and smash into the Pentagon in a field in Pennsylvania. What are we going to do? It's a non-traditional enemy. The expression is an enemy we can't see. What are we going to do?
And this is a key question that the 9/11 Commission considered. And what they found in the postmortem, when they looked at all of the classified intelligence from all of the different intelligence agencies, they found that we had all of the information we needed as an intelligence community, as a classified sector, as the national defense of the United States, to detect this plot. We actually had records of the phone calls from the United States and out. The CIA knew who these guys were. The problem was not that we weren't collecting information. It wasn't that we didn't have enough dots. It wasn't that we didn't have a haystack. It was that we did not understand the haystack that we have. The problem with mass surveillance is that we're piling more hay on a haystack we already don't understand. And this is the haystack of the human lives of every American citizen in our country. If these programs aren't keeping us safe, and they're making us miss connections, vital connections, on information we already have, if we're taking resources away from traditional methods of investigation, from law enforcement operations that we know work, if we're missing things like the Boston Marathon bombings, where all of these mass surveillance systems, every domestic dragnet in the world, didn't reveal guys that the Russian intelligence service told us about by name. Is that really the best way to protect our country? Or are we trying to throw money at a magic solution that's actually not just costing us our safety, but our rights and our way of life?
the CIA an army of individuals who have a license to kill? It's like Murder Incorporated, right?
Oh, are you kidding? The CIA makes the mafia look like a Sunday school class. I mean, this is the problem with what's actually happened in Afghanistan. Look, the CIA has done in this country, what they've done to us is unbelievable. Look at the terrorist acts that have occurred. The CIA behind most, if not all of them. We had the Marine Barracks. We had our embassy in Kenya. We had Pan Am 103. We had the USS Cole. We had Oklahoma City. We had the World Trade Center in 1993. Our government was involved in some of those. I can't say all of them because I don't know, but I do have documentation that there was government implication in some of these, and we'll discuss them as we go.
Well, Ted, the people out there, I mean did you know that the World Trade Center went up when it was bombed internally? That it all was put together by an organization called the FBI. Is that
this is 1993?
Yeah.
Yes, I have I'll show this on camera, a newspaper article from the New York Times, and it was also an article in the LA Times, by the way, and it's dated October 28, 1993, and it's a result of testimony in the trial, and the informant, the FBI informant in the trial, a fellow named Salam, a 43-year-old former Egyptian army officer.
Imam Salam.
Right. He was the informant for the FBI. And he recorded his conversations secretly with this. So when it came time for trial, he said, hey, wait a minute. Here's what really happened. Now, he told the FBI in advance that they were going to bomb it. He was assigned, given the assignment to put the bomb together. And he went to his supervisor, his FBI supervisor, and said, we're going to put a dummy bomb in here, right? And the FBI supervisor said, no, we're going to put a real bomb.
Oh, wait a minute. Let's name names. John Antisef
was the supervisor.
Yeah, he was the supervisor for the FBI, and he winds up in with having something to do with the Kenya investigation. So here's a guy who's involved in setting up the World Trade Center for to be blown up, and it resulted in the deaths of six individuals, over 1,000 injured. Nearly $100 million.
$500 million.
A lot of millions of dollars.
Millions of dollars, yeah.
And
in debt property damage.
Right. Now, if justice were done, the FBI agent would be not only in jail, but executed for murder in the first degree. And is the chief suspect in the attack upon the World Trade Center on September 11th, is not the chief suspect the individuals or individual agency that bombed the World Trade Center in 1993?
Based on what happened in 1993, the FBI not only knew in advance they were going to bomb the World Trade Center, they furnished the ingredients for the bomb. Based on that, I would say that the FBI is the primary suspect, but also I think we have to consider the CIA. And the reason you have to consider the CIA is because when you skyjack 4 airplanes simultaneously with 19 skyjackers, that is no small operation. That took years to plan, number one, and hundreds of people had to know about it in advance. Now, our government, NSA, was monitoring bin Laden's phone calls in February 1998. Are you going to tell me for 1 minute that we didn't know about this in advance? The CIA had to know about it. The FBI had to know about it. The Mossad had to know about it.
Now,
MI5, British intelligence, had to know about it.
The CIA knows about it. The FBI knows about it. The Commander-in-Chief, the President, would have to know about it.
Of course he does.
And that would mean that Bush had prior knowledge, and that would implicate him in reality, if we wanted to face this thing as it really is, in murder in the first degree.
Let me explain to the audience what's happened here. Okay, back in the 80s, 1980s, the Department of Justice proposed legislation to fight terrorism. And this legislation took away many of our constitutional rights and civil liberties. One of the authors, a female attorney with the Department of Justice, publicly made this statement, I've got her name on my file someplace, that before this passes, people will have to be killed. Well, so that was the reason, I feel, for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Unfortunately for them, fortunately for us, the good guys, there were only 6 people killed, not enough to pass the legislation. So what happened is 3 years later, no, 93, 2 years later, April 19, 1995, down comes Oklahoma City Murrah building, 168 people killed. 1 year later, the anti-terrorism legislation that takes away many of our constitutional rights and civil liberties is passed. And now with the Twin Towers World Trade Center episode, our Congress is now proposing further restrictions on our constitutional rights and civil liberties. These explosions, these terrorist acts, were an excuse to pass anti-terrorism legislation.
And then to implement it.
And then to yes. And this is what's happening in the world today. And that's why our intelligence people are not only knew about in advance, but probably involved. There's no question. You cannot possibly have an operation of this magnitude without our people knowing about it. Now, our government, the FBI...
When you say our government, and I got to challenge you. This isn't our government.
Well,
it's the banksters' government, because they control both political parties.
The government knows the what, where, why, and when, and how. And I had a FBI supervisor brag about this to somebody else, and it got back to me, of every patriot and every militia in the United States. Now, if they know that, are you going to tell me that they're not going to know about the terrorists coming and going? By the way, this operation, based on information that's come out since the attack, the terrorist attack, was planned in England, London, England. The training took place in Afghanistan and in the United States. And these terrorists came in and took pilot training here. And as I said earlier, bin Laden's phone conversations were monitored, according to the press, in February 1998. Are you going to say they didn't monitor him after that? No.
Well, wait a minute, no.
The NSA employs probably 150,000 people. I don't know what their payroll is. I mean, it's the number of personnel. But they have taps on virtually everybody in America. This was part of the anti-terrorism legislation that was passed after Oklahoma City.
Well, that's exactly what Adolf Hitler did when he burnt down the Reichstag.
The first warrant was served on September 11th of 2001, but was postponed. It would not be until November of 2001 when the police would finally make an attempt to raid Cooper. Cooper's broadcasts at this time had already been looking into the federal government's compliance in the events of 9/11.
One of the things that makes everybody wonder why Bill's life was snuffed out in 2001 was because in June of that year, Osama bin Laden, who was a relative unknown at that time, Bill had been following the news and found a lot of curiosities and went on the air predicting that there would be a major attack in the United States and that it would be blamed on Osama bin Laden, but he was literally the scapegoat that was being used, not truly behind the attacks. So that, I mean, just a few months before the events of September 11th, and then of course Bill's life cut short shortly thereafter.
Supposedly, a CNN reporter found Osama bin Laden, took a television camera crew with him, went into Osama bin Laden's hideout, interviewed him and his top leadership, and he came out and told everybody, within 3 weeks, Osama bin Laden is going to attack the United States and Israel. Now, don't you think that's kind of strange, folks? You see, because the largest intelligence apparatus in the world, with the biggest budget in the history of the world, has been looking for Osama bin Laden for years and years and years, and can't find him. Some doofus jerk-off reporter with a camera crew waltzes right into his hideout and interviews him. And I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack. But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those behind the New World Order. I wonder what Osama bin Laden's targets are supposed to be. And if they don't, if this doesn't materialize in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it will eventually materialize because they haven't succeeded in getting the guns out of the hands of the American people, nor have they succeeded in taking our freedoms away. And so I can tell you with a certainty, they must do something terrible in order to stop this backlash and regain the sympathy of the mass herds of sheeple out there.
Potentially, we're talking here about the biggest murder case in American history by far. If any of you like to get angry, I can tell you that what I'm going to say is going to get you very, very, very angry. These people take outrageous, disgusting human behavior to previously unimaginable heights. How evil, how perverse, how sick, how criminal. Can anything possibly be more abominable? And there are over 100,000 precious human beings in their graves right now as I'm talking to you because of it.
There's no prosecutor I would want to have if I were innocent more than Vince, and there's no prosecutor I'd fear more if I were guilty. He will get at the truth.
My legacy, for whatever it's worth, is on the line here. And I can tell you I would not be doing what I'm doing unless I'm very confident that under the law, he's guilty of murder and should be prosecuted.
And I think the question is, can a president be prosecuted for activities undertaken while in office? I mean, that's the opening question, and I think the answer to that is very simple, and it's yes.
Unless this nation is about to be attacked, you don't go to war without telling the people whose daughters and sons are going to die in a foreign land why you're going to do it.
My son
caught in the middle of these people decisions.
Losing a child is just something that I'd never dreamed would happen.
We all can do something about it.
And we all should.
Mr. Bugliosi's basic theory is absolutely sound.
Couldn't reasonable men disagree about what an imminent threat is and is not? I mean, this is fresh on the blood of people in the World Trade Center. So there is and was a certain urgency. It's not like there was an urgency.
Against whom? The American government believed that the guy responsible for 3,000 murders was at Tora Bora. Do you know how many soldiers George Bush...
Not enough.
No, you're wrong. Not one. How do you justify not sending one single soldier after the person responsible for 3,000 murders, not one soldier, but send 150,000 against someone who was as involved in 9/11 as you and I? How do you justify that?
Well, it's a very good question.
16 federal intelligence agencies, their conclusion that Hussein was not an imminent threat to the security of this country was completely deleted from the white paper. And the white paper is what was shown to Congress and the American people. And after 731 inspections, they found no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Our money is going to kill people. Things are that bad out there. They really are.
Now, how could this possibly happen in the United States of America?
I'm a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War. I was responsible for several hundred patrols and raids and ambushes. And anytime we got pissed off, we took it out on innocent people. And as many veterans there are standing up and speaking out and throwing down their arms against this war, the civilian movement needs to back them up on it as well. This is reality. This is real.
Young American soldiers are being blown to pieces by roadside bombs in Iraq, and as he would so much like to do, wash his hands of all culpability, it's not quite that easy. And I'm very confident that if an American jury heard the evidence against George Bush, when they came back into that courtroom with their verdict of guilty, they would tell Bush, it's not quite that easy. Under federal law, Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 2B, provides, quote, whoever willfully causes, that's the key word, whoever willfully causes an act to be done, which, if directly performed by him, would be a crime, is punishable as a principle. That's federal law. The courts have held that the defendant, quote, is as guilty as if he had done the act himself, unquote. If justice means anything in America, and if we're not going to forget the thousands of young American soldiers in their graves whom Bush deceived into thinking that they were fighting for America against an enemy that had attacked us, then I say we have no choice but to bring murder charges against the son of privilege from Crawford, Texas. All I need is a grand jury in some little town in America, and all of a sudden things are going to change very quickly. Take my word for that. Apart from the main fact that if George Bush and other members of his administration, like Dick Cheney, are guilty of murder, as the evidence shows, they must be prosecuted for it. They have to be brought to justice. I don't have to tell you that we're living in a very hostile, extremely incendiary world. Now's the time, perhaps more than ever before, for America to show the world its leadership in democracy, morality, and the rule of law. I mean, we can't call for democracy and the rule of law in foreign nations, which we do all the time, when they see that we invaded a sovereign nation, Iraq, without any provocation at all. And thousands upon thousands of innocent Iraqis and young American soldiers are dead as a result. And we don't do anything at all about it. We let the architects of this monumental crime get away with it completely. No justice, no punishment, not even an investigation, nothing. How can we set a terrible, terrible example like this and then expect other nations, to act in a way that they know we did not. After Bush invaded Iraq, for the first time ever, the majority of people in the world had a negative feeling about America. Nothing would improve our image and restore our credibility more in the eyes of the world than bringing George Bush and his administration to justice for taking this nation to war in Iraq on a lie, under false pretenses. We would be telling the world's people that invading and destroying Iraq with the incalculable death, horror, and suffering that resulted was not the real America, only George Bush's America, that the real America would never do something like this, that in the real America, no man is above the law, and even presidents are accountable for their crimes. Also, if we want to deter future presidents from taking this nation to another war under false pretenses, one that our children or their children might die in, that deterrence obviously would increase tremendously if these future presidents knew what happened to George Bush. This is a very important and pivotal moment in American history. Whatever the obstacles are, we have to seize that moment and do the right thing by bringing the Bush administration to justice. It's really a test of who we are as a people and whether or not we want to live up to our reputation as being a great nation.